Hey everybody, my name is Luis and welcome to this webinar. I'm really excited to be able to share some of this stuff with you guys. You might have seen some of the work that was done at GDC about this kind of games tool shelf and these Vertex Animation Tools. I've gotten a lot of good feedback from everybody, and I just wanted to take the time and do kind of an informal presentation of just kind of me going through the workflow myself, so you guys can see how it's actually done. And if I know a couple of people have run into little snags here and there, so this is just a good way of clarifying any questions. You guys can post questions, and then Chris is also on the line, and he'll kind of forward them to me. We're going to save some time at the end to do some Q&A, so I'll just get started. The other thing to mention too is that Chris will be posting a couple of links at the webinar. I'm not sure if he'd done already, of files that you can download, basically where you can download the project for GDC, and then where you can get the latest HDA, which is going to be in the new GitHub, which I'll talk about a little bit. But just as a general introduction, you guys might have seen this project, but if you haven't, this is similar to what we're going to create. We're going to create something a little different, just so it's not the same thing again. These files are up, the source and the project is up on Dropbox, and there's a Vimeo link that we'll share with you guys to get to it if you haven't seen it already, but you can just Google it and you find it. But what you're seeing here is basically all of these simulations are being run by textures. And then the cool thing here is that we're actually simming everything in Houdini and then exporting it out into Unreal using textures, which they look something like this. And then in the shader, we're recreating that motion and playing it back. So we have 4 different ways of getting the data out. So the simplest one is this cloth. And I'll go into a little bit of detail when we're building it, but the idea here is that you have the same topology running through the whole simulation. And then what we're doing is we're just setting the positions and the normals of that mesh as the time passes. And then we also have fluid, which is the kind of more sexy one and the more expensive one, which is you have a similar technique where you're just kind of setting the positions and the normals, but you are doing it on something that is changing the topology. So this is, you can do fluid, water and just liquids, and you can also do explosions and kind of volumes with it. You can see in this one, it doesn't show as well as the one that we're going to show built together, but you can actually get color information into it and then run a ramp through it. You can also do rigid bodies. So this is actually, it's basically a static mesh that you're playing back animation using these materials. And these are really, really cheap because basically you're storing the animation per chunk. So if this, let's see how many chunks this has. So this has 50 chunks. So the texture, as you can see, is tiny. It's basically 50 by 120 or 119, which is actually the size of my animation. So we'll get into the size of the textures in a little bit in the future as we go through it. But you can see how pretty lightweight, and you can get that playing back as you would a skeletal mesh. And then finally, we have the sprite technique, which is if you wanted to do basically points on camera-facing sprites, and you just animate some points in Houdini, and then you bring them out, and they play back as kind of camera-facing cards. So the project that we're actually going to work with is this one. And I did this as a dry run to just kind of see if I could do it and if I hit any snags. But the idea here is you have the same kind of cloth technique that we showed with the other one, same rigid body, but the fluid is going to be a little bit different. I'm actually going to show you guys how to get a ramp in there so you can see there's a little bit of the temperature playing back into it. And then we are going to also make an emissive version of that material, because for fire, you might not want it to be a opaque material. You might want it to be emissive. And then I'm going to get the time permitting, hopefully, we'll get to the sprite ones, and then that is going to be advected by the fire simulation, so you can have the little embers playing back. The nice thing is you can see this is full 3D mesh, but it looks pretty decent. And then the idea here is that this is kind of ideal for VR because you can have full volume as opposed to just having kind of like a cheap trick with a card. But that's what we're going to get into it. So let's just jump right into Houdini. And then again, the HDA is currently in the build, but there's a few things that I've updated. Even some, I'm just kind of fixing bugs and fixing little comments on the shaders in Unreal. So I'll get you guys an updated one, and then hopefully it'll be in the build shortly. So let's hop over to Houdini. And then I just have regular Houdini 16. There is this new games tool shelf. I'll take a little bit of time to kind of explain. You can just add it by going here, shelves, and there's going to be games if you have Houdini up. There's a few tools up here. A lot of them are to dealing with normal maps and cops, which I'm not going to get into it today. But the idea is just you have some ability in cops, which is our compositing network, to basically manipulate images, normal map images. So you can generate normal map from grayscale, rotate them, and do some stuff. There's also some tools for flow maps, which are another webinar altogether. So we're not going to spend time on that. But the idea to create a flow map, be able to guide it with curves, drop an obstacle like a sphere on the path of the flow map and have it deform, and then be able to export that to just vertex color so you can then bake it or get it out however you need to for your game engine. Make loop we're actually going to use today. So the fire is looping, so I'm going to show you guys how to make fire loop by just with the simple node. Texture sheets is to basically write out sprite sheet from your camera. It's going to be outside the scope of this talk today, just because it takes a little bit to render, and I don't want to waste everybody's time. I'm already going to waste some time with just caching. And then there's rigid body to FBX, which gets the destruction, much like that pig exploding. If you don't want to use the texture animation and you just want to bake things out to a skeleton, you can do it that way. And then finally, the one that we are really going to talk about today is this Vertex Animation Textures, which you can use the shell tool, and that one is pretty up to date. But there's still a couple of little things that I've fixed in the latest one that hopefully will be in the build soon. So let's start with the cloth. First off, and I'm gonna try to go as fast as not possible, but trying to give you guys enough time to digest the data and kind of go off on tangents. This is not scripted at all, so if there's questions that are relevant, Chris will interrupt me and kind of pitch in. And so let's just get started. Because I like the pig head, I'm going to be dropping a lot of pig heads today, and most of the effects are going to be based on that. So we just drop in a pig head, and then all you have to do to make this collidable is you go into the shelf tool, hit collisions, hit static object, and now the simulation network gets created, and this is actually a collision object. So that's all you have to do for setting up that so the cloth collides against the pig head. For our cloth itself, I'm going to drop a grid. Let's make it a little bit smaller, like we can show ghost other objects so I can see what I'm doing. Maybe let's do 5 by 5. Move it a tiny bit up, maybe 2. That's too far. 1.3, so that's about good. And then all you have to do for actually making something cloth, you just hit the cloth button, and you can select the cloth object, and that's all you do. So what we do here is you just press play, and hopefully things are going to start colliding. And that's pretty straightforward. So that's basically the effect. As you can see, it's kind of chunky because the resolution of the cloth is not super high. So here's something that blew my mind recently. You guys might know that W is to turn on wireframe, and that's a pretty well-known shortcut. But if you hit W to go back, if you hit Shift W, you get shaded, which usually I had to come here and wireframe unshaded do that kind of stuff. So that kind of changed my life recently, and hopefully it'll change yours too. So let's see. Okay, so that's super coarse. If we go back to our grid, we can see how many polygons it is. So it's 100 polygons. That's super low. Let's crank that up a little bit. So let's try something like 25 by 25. And then if you middle mouse over the node, you can kind of see how many points that is. It's still pretty low. So 600 points. Let's go up to maybe 50 by 50. And let's see. Okay, 2500, that's going to take a little bit, but we can take some questions or kind of chat a little bit as things are simming. Yeah, so that's pretty dense. But if you hit play, it's going to do its thing. And I will do some sing and dance while it's caching. Or I can open another one. We'll go into Unreal and we can kind of start playing with it. Okay, so now it's going to cache beautifully. The other thing that I did do, and I'll drop this in, I'm going to drop this down to something quick just so we can see what the hell we're doing. The other thing you can do too is drop a ground plane. So sometimes if you have weird geometry, it will kind of drape and kind of fall off the edge of the earth. So one thing you can do is you can drop a ground plane, and you can move the ground plane down a little bit, and that will kind of keep it as the kind of bottommost collision for your simulation. So let's just let this rip. So one thing that I do like to do is, we're not going to touch that geo, is actually, so if we run this, it's going to take a little bit, and then it's going to be cached, but then sometimes you might notice that as you're doing things, it might kind of have to recache itself, or as you're exporting, it's going to have to recache, and this is kind of, you can scrub it, but it's okay. What I like to do is drop a file cache, and then what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to save this file first, and then we're going to go into the webinar, and let's say this is going to be cloth live. And what the file cache node does is basically write out the geometry into the hard drive, which is nice because now we can just write it off to disk and we don't have to deal with it. Before joining SideFX, I actually never used this in production, and I always complained about how it's always recooking my stuff, and then I learned that that's usually what you want to be doing. You want to be dropping, as soon as you have something that you like, you just drop off a file cache. So we can also check it to load from disk, and that's going to error because there's nothing written out to disk yet. So if we just hit save to disk, a little dialog box is going to come up, and you can see it goes fairly quickly. And if you're doing something that's kind of longer, usually you're going to blow out of memory sometimes if you're doing something that's like a cloth sim that is super detailed. So writing things out to disk would allow you to kind of keep everything in memory, which is nice. And you can see now I can kind of scrub this and do whatever I want.
Hey, Luis,
so now,
quick question.
Yes?
Will the simulation work in Unity?
Yes, it will, but you need to write the Unity shaders. So that's my next task, and which I should have started this week, but I did this instead. But yeah, absolutely, it will work in Unity. You will need the Unity shaders, which you can write yourself, and I will show you how the Unreal shaders are set up. So if you know how to write Unity shaders, it should be fairly straightforward. If not, you can just wait a couple of weeks, and that's literally my next task, is to write the Unity shaders. Thanks for the question, and then please keep interrupting me because just there's enough content to kind of keep adding things out, especially as I'm caching things, so please interrupt me. So now we have that. The other thing that I will want to do here is I want to drop a normal node just to make sure that my geometry has normals because I want to write that out to the game. And then I want them to be on points because I don't really want to deal with the vertex normals right now, just because you're going to have to do a vertex split because of the way we're writing the textures out to or writing out the normals out to a texture. It's basically one per point. So if you want to have split normals to where there's two normals per point, you have to do some shenanigans of basically doing some vertex split. For brevity's sake, let's just put it in points and move on. And okay, so now we have that, and now the setup is complete for your file. The other thing too is like if you guys know this real time, if you want to play that a little bit faster, you can click that. Then what we want to do is, this is another kind of thing that I've just started using since I joined SideFX about a year ago, is this out context. So in Houdini, you might notice that we call like chops, ROPs, DOPs, all of these ops things, POPs. So SOPs is this object context, COPs is the image context, which is for compositing, and then there's this ROP, which is for rendering operators. And what the rendering operators do is basically set up a little change for exporting. And in game context, that's basically your exporters. So all of the tools are, a lot of the tools that are kind of exporter based, so like this, all these three tools are all in these out context. So if you, a common thing that people will do is they'll come here and they'll be like, okay, Vertex Animate, it's like, where is it? And it doesn't show up. It's because you need to go to the out. And that's mostly an organization thing. I know that there is some ROP things out here. So there's these guys that people like to use. So some people, not ROP network, but you can basically write out the geometry from here or write a limbic from here. But the really nice workflow is, or the proper workflow is to kind of come out into out and do it. So let's do, so I actually have 3 vertex animation textures. The one that we care about is this beta one, which is the one from GitHub that you guys will use. The one in games is the one that you're going to have by default, and this digital asset one is just one that I have for kind of development and working. So once you get the things out of GitHub, which let's just go into a side tangent really quick because I like tangents. This is what, if you guys are familiar, so there's this github.com SideFX game development tool set that Stephen Burchard started maybe 2 years ago at this point, and it kind of went to the wayside a little bit when I joined. The idea was that we wouldn't need to use GitHub anymore. We could just build things straight into the Houdini build. But after talking to people, a lot of people really like the idea of us being able to develop tools and putting things up, and they can get it immediately, and then we can use GitHub as a kind of hardening location where the tools can kind of mature a little bit before they go into the build. So I'm starting it back up. By default, you're going to be dropped into this Houdini 15 branch, which is, you can see Steve Burchard's little head there. And the idea here is that we have this development branch, which has the new stuff. You can see there's a little bit of a change. So if you're looking at it, that you're in the right place. I talk a little bit about the different things that we're doing. So the live development is basically as I'm working, I'm going to be dropping things there so you can grab it. If you watch us in news and announcements and stuff like that, we'll be posting things there. And then, yes,
the link to that is posted in the chat windows for anybody that's trying to find it.
Awesome, thank you. And then the other thing that we're using is Houdini 16 has expanded HDAs, which means the HDAs are a folder as opposed to a single file. And the nice thing about that is that you can actually diff the files. So as you're seeing these, you can see in my OTLs. Right now I only have the flipbook generator, the Vertex Animation Texture, and an update to the flow map to color. So you can see like these are all just text, and you can go in and kind of see all my changes. But the idea here is that you will go into Game Development Toolset, switch to Development. You want to download the zip file, and then once you have the zip file, you can open it. And if you want, you can just take the OTL straight out of here, or you can just install the whole thing as instructed here. So that's a little side tangent about GitHub and what we're going to do with it. The idea is that all of the tools that are currently in the game tool itself will eventually come here with updated versions, and then there will be this nice cycle of things will get developed in GitHub and then move back into the main Houdini build. So PSA over. Let's get back to this. So we dropped this node in. You can see just a single node. In here, let's go through the parameters a little bit. So we have this method, and those are the 4 things that I kind of talked to you guys about in Unreal. So there's the soft, which is if you have same topology, rigid, fluid, sprites. The interface will change a little bit based on each of these. So you can see how that works. For our case, we want soft because we basically have the same topology throughout the setup. The export node is the node that we want to export. So in our case, we want to export to grid. And actually, if we want to go a little bit more precise, let's export. It would be the file cache? No, it would be the normal. So the other nice thing to do is always put a null or an output at the end of your things and call it out. And that's so you can work a little bit better. So the other little tangent that I'll go into is on the setup. So I started to kind of like a couple of different setups. So hitting P will give you the parameter windows right here, which will kind of give you a nicer interface instead of having things kind of pushed together. The other thing that I will do is use the new quick marks in Houdini 16. So if you hit Control 1, it's kind of like an Unreal where you can drop off cameras. You can basically, if you move it around and then you hit 1, it kind of jumps back to where you dropped it. So what I like to do is I like to drop 1 in out, which is in here, and we can kind of see my parameters. And you drop another one with Control 2. So now if you're kind of going back and forth, it's super nice to be able to just kind of hop around the network, and it's not just like, oh, let me go back here or kind of backspace, and then you're kind of lost. So it's, as you're iterating, sometimes you'll have even 3 or 4 to where you have multiple objects that you're kind of playing with. Then the geometry path, I'm just going to leave the defaults, which is basically wherever my scene file is saved, that's the hip. I'm going to make a subfolder called export, and I'm going to name my meshes, whatever my thing is called, my scene is called, _mesh, and then whatever my scene is called, _position. I don't want to pack my normals into the alpha, and this is an optimization that if you don't really care about the normals of the scene, if you're doing something that's emissive and you just kind of want it to be mostly there, or if you're really crunched for space, we do have an optimization that lets you pack the normal into a single channel. As you can imagine, that kind of compresses the snot out of it, and that's it's in there if you guys want to use it, and sometimes it's useful, especially if in something like the fire that you don't really care about the normals and you just want to kind of get something quickly. Okay, so that's all we should need. Another quick question that people usually have for me is this normalized 0 to 1 space is basically, if you don't check that, you can't use low dynamic range images, which means you have to use an EXR. So here, if I change this to Targa, it would work. But for my case, I like using EHR, so just so we don't have to worry about anything. The other question that I get is these two fields, what do I type in here? These are just for the real-time shader, so you shouldn't have to type anything in here. Unfortunately, I have to leave these unlocked so you can copy and paste. You can't copy and paste this number, but this number is usually an integer, so it's easy to copy. But these numbers sometimes get crazy broken, so I left this on. But once you hit render, these will get filled in, so don't stress too much about them. If we hit render, this will pop up, and hopefully I can catch it fast enough to where it went, and you can see how it basically generated those two numbers, and I have my OBJs or my FBX and positions exported. So now we're back. Now we're ready to go into Unreal, and this was a little bit longer than I'd hoped to kind of get the setup done, but at least it kind of show you guys a bunch of little side tangents. So if we go into that project, and let's make a new folder in here. Let's call that live cloth. And let's import our mesh. So it's going to be this cloth live mesh, normal and position. Let's open that in. The defaults are fine. And it's going to say no smoothing group. That's fine because we don't really care about, or Houdini doesn't export out smoothing group information. It writes out the normal explicitly into the meshes. So that doesn't apply. So now you can see we have these textures. And what the hell is going on with these textures? Let me pull that across. Let me close some windows on my other monitor to kind of make it so you guys can see it. Come on. My webinar window is finding my Unreal window, so give me 1 second. Okay, drag and drop that across. So for cloth in particular, what we're writing is actually delta positions from the first frame. So in my first few frames, the cloth is really not doing much. So you can see that it's kind of, there's not a lot of information, but then as it starts to deform, we're writing out information. And every frame is a row, and every point is a column. So as you can imagine, we have, maybe we dive into that a little bit, is on our mesh, we do write out a second UV set, which is hard to see in here, but we can go into Houdini and see it. So we have this first UV set, which is just a planar projection, which is what my mesh had. So if you want to do like a flag with some texture on it, you still have full ability of kind of customizing that. The second UV set is actually just a line, and you can see it here, where basically it's every single point on the mesh in sequence. And what we're doing on the shader, we're just moving this line down, and that line is actually reading this texture. So if you can imagine the UV coming here and then just sampling the data, and then as it's animating, it's kind of moving down, and then once it starts to hit some data, it's basically just reading whatever value is here and then setting it directly to be the position of the geometry. That's essentially what it's doing. So we have two textures written out. So we have the normal and the position. It looks like a normal map because we are compressing it to be from 0 to 1. So it kind of it looks the same way because we're using the same trick as a real normal map does. And then, but as you can see, it doesn't match the UVs at all. It's just kind of, it's purely data. And because it's purely data, you can't compress it. Because if you did any kind of block compressing, it would completely garble the data. So that's the one kind of limitation for it. But as you can see, the textures is the size of the how many points you have times whatever frames you have. So in our case, it's 100 by 239, which is tiny. So it's not awful. So okay, now we have our mesh, we have our textures, we're missing our material. So we open up the default material that kind of gets generated, and it's just a flat color. And then you go, okay, how the hell am I doing this? But fear not. You can either use our project that is there and already has the materials. We're shipping some data with the Houdini plugin that you guys can also see, but the way that I like to do it is if I go back into Houdini, I actually added some of the shader code for Houdini or for Unreal here, and we'll figure out a way to do this for Unity as well once we get down to that point. So we have the shader code for the soft, rigid, fluid, and vertex. So all you have to do is you come here, Control A, copy, hop over back into Unreal, paste, and it actually drops the whole network, which is a nice feature from Unreal. I kind of on purposely put the nodes on the other side, on the right side of the main shader block or the material block, and then all of the other stuff would be on the left, so you can kind of know how to frame it. And I don't care about my frame rate because I am recording and showing my screen. So you can see, actually, it's fairly commented to where it tells you how to connect everything, and a couple of notes. So one of the notes is to make sure that tangent space is off. So because we're writing out the basically world space UV or normals, we want to turn off the tangents. And then we want to add some custom UVs. It's saying to add 3 channels, so let's hit 3. And I'll get into that once we kind of break down the shader. So we connect this to base color, this to specular, this to roughness, this to normal, world position offset, and then there's the 2 UVs which are going to be down here somewhere. So this goes into custom UV1, and this goes into custom UV2. All right, so now let's see what the hell's going on the material, and this is the only one that I'll kind of go into it. It looks scary, but it's fairly not complex at all. So the first parts that we're going to start off with is basically this little part. So what we're doing here is we're actually just taking the time, we're multiplying it by the speed, and then we're doing basically flipbook math. So in our case, it's okay if we wanted to interpolate and kind of move the UVs down. So kind of like as we're moving it down on the texture, it's okay to kind of interpolate it, but if you have more than 8,000 points, what we do, and it really like the logical limit, that's another question that a lot of people have, is how big can I make these things until it starts to fall apart? We found that about 6,000 points or 6,000 pixels, the precision starts to kind of hurt. So we try to keep everything under like around a 4K or a 6K. So if you have more points than you have texture resolution, on the X, we actually break the UVs, and then we give you 2 rows of UVs. So instead of kind of having one long row, you can actually have as many rows as you need. And then in that case, you kind of have to move in chunks. And that's what this is doing. So basically, it figures out how many number of frames you have, and then it kind of lets you kind of hop the blocks together. Then we kind of add that in. So we have the second UV set, so it's texture coordinate 1. We want to split the red and the green. So then the green is going to be the vertical. We're just adding that offset into it. And then we're sampling the position map, which is the one that we exported out. This is for basically normalizing the data. So if you choose to use a low dynamic range texture, we take that bounding box, max and min, and just unpack that 0 to 1 to be within the range that is specified. And then this basically does all of the actor transform. So if you rotate, scale, or move your actor, this little node does the conversion for you. And then you funnel that into the world position. So really not a lot that's going on. So basically, for all intents and purposes, we're figuring out how much we need to animate the UVs by. We add the UVs together, we read the texture. We unpack the data, we shoot that over to the world position offset. This is some math for unpacking that single channel into float 3. I won't get into the math for this right now. It's beyond the scope. It's something that you guys, if you guys want to dive into it, it's there. But I'm just going to skip ahead and say that we have a custom normal map. So we kind of use the same UVs, we sample the normal map, and then choose whether or not we're packing the normal. And then this is where it gets interesting. So a lot of people, before I had these comments, they would just take the normal map and then funnel into the normal. And then they'll be like, hey, Luis, that doesn't look right. What's going on? So this normal is actually evaluated on the pixel shader, and this world position offset is evaluated on the vertex shader. So if you know about the kind of vertex pipelines, the mesh comes into the graphics card, it goes into, there's like the compute shaders and some other stuff that happens before, but essentially like after some point, it goes into the vertex shader, where it basically can do anything to the UVs, to the positions, to the normals, and then it takes that data and then it puts it into screen space, and then it moves it over to the pixel shader. And then on the pixel shaders where you kind of have per pixel information, and that's where most of the math happens. So this stuff happens once per pixel, and this stuff happens once per vert. We want to sample this texture once per vert. We don't want to sample it per pixel because we're doing things on the vert level. So to do that, we actually have to stuff it into these custom UVs to kind of so they can get passed into the pixel shader. So basically there's this custom UV 1 and 2, and we're basically just, you stuff that in so it gets handed off, and you kind of pick it back up on the pixel shader here using the texture coordinates, much like this one. So here now, if it makes sense, in this area I'm working on the vertex shader. In this area I'm working on the pixel shader, and I'm just kind of getting the handoff of the same data. I'm kind of building it back together because a texture coordinate only has 2 channels and I want to use 3 channels. I'm building it back together, I'm normalizing it, and then this is some shenanigans that I do so you can light the back sides of the cloth, which I can show you guys what that looks like. But this kind of went for long enough, so let's see some cool stuff. So basically this connects to the normal, that now goes into the normal, and you're done. If you want to kind of do shenanigans with colors and adding roughness, which didn't get connected, you can do that here. And this would be your normal kind of shader land if you want to do texture blending and some other stuff, that will go there. Okay, so now we have this material. Let's make a material instance. Let's call this live cloth matte. And let's assign our textures. So now you can see we have all those parameters. We want to override a couple of things. So we want to override the position, and that's going to be this guy. We want to override this pack normal because we don't want to pack no normal, and we're going to override the bounding box and the number of frames. Let's just uncheck those. Okay, so now we have a normal map because we unpack that. Set that in. This is where you want to pack that data. So in our case, because I was lazy and just used the defaults, our number of frames is 239, but the max and the min are over here. So let's just copy, paste, and then let's go back in and copy, paste. So now that's all we should have. So let's see if this works. Let's drop in our cloth mesh. And you can see that's basically, it's the first frame of the simulation. Let me clear some space out of my window and shut up. Okay, so now we apply that. And you can see that is exactly what we rendered out. And it's playing back. So now you guys have a whole thing. I know this took a little bit, but you have a whole soup to nuts beginning and end, all the way how to kind of the whole system works. So now we can kind of start having fun with it and kind of playing with it. So the nice thing about this technique, just with this one thing that you guys already know how to do and you know how all the kind of inner guts work, you can do cloth, so you can do flags, you can do tarps, you can do anything that's cloth related. You can do hair, so you can have, I know a few people are already doing this to where they're animating hair on a character for like a cinematic, and then they're playing that back using this technique. You can do skin meshes, so if you want to have background animals like fish or Uncharted 4 use the similar technique to animate chicken, you can do that. You can do soft bodies, so you can do those as well. So there's a lot, like if you want things animating and just kind of deforming and melting, as long as the topology is not changing, you can use this. And this essentially is the same technique that Epic has using that kind of Vertex Animation texture. And this is where kind of everything started from. So they did that part, and then Norman Char and Mario Palmero did it over in Tequila Works. They kind of took that and kind of ran with it and did a Gamma Sutra post. And I kind of talked to them a little bit about how they did it, and they were nice enough to kind of help. Norman was been basically help me through this whole process and kind of get it to where it is today. So now we basically, yes.
Nicholas is wondering if maybe this is a good way to compress sims in Houdini as well. So applying it to when rendering out through Mantra.
Yes, absolutely. And I am planning on, after the Unity one, but you can do this fairly easily, is you can just cache this out, and then you just have basically a VOP, like a point VOP that can read the texture and then apply that in. And that's something that a lot of the film people have been kind of asking. And absolutely, you can definitely do that. And in theory, it should be more efficient, but I can't speak to the Mantra side of things. But yeah, great question. And keep it coming, because this is, it's a two-way street. But yeah, so that's basically cloth in a nutshell. And now you guys can do some cool stuff with that. So let's go to the next one, which is going to be this rigid body one. So let's just make a new scene in Houdini. Save that. New scene. This is kind of fun because, why not? That's a bug. So let's drop this geometry. Let's drop our favorite pig. Let's move it up a little bit. So maybe 2. Let's add that ground plane. And so now we have a pig ready to fall. Let's break the pig up into some chunks. So just for brevity, let's just use the shatter. And what that does is basically it converts the pig into a volume. It adds some chunks or some points inside of that volume. If you don't have that, the points are going to be scattered on the surface of the object, and you don't want that. You want the objects to be scattered like inside of the pig. So that's why it's converted to a volume. And then that's going to apply to the Voronoi, which, if you guys know already, exploded view can help you visualize what's going on. This is not big enough, so I want to go to maybe 30 chunks, maybe 40 chunks. Let's do 50 chunks. And you can see that, like, you could still pull this off with the joint setup, but if I start getting into 200 chunks, probably a joint setup will fall apart. So let's also blow the material out of this guy, just because I don't want to deal with that right now. You can apply kind of inside and outside materials and have that work, as you saw in the other example, but let's just skip that so we can delete that attribute. So let's do maybe not 200 because that's a little bit excessive. Let's do 70 just so we can render out fast. And you can see how fast it is to kind of just move it, and the whole thing is live. For people that are new to Houdini, that usually blows their mind of just being able to kind of like going back in and modifying things. Okay, so if we take this out, and then we go into our rigid body shelf, and we hit fracture object, and this is important, packed. You want packed and not fractured. So you hit packed, select the body, go, and boom. So now you have a pig falling and kind of shattering. This is cool, and it's usually the first thing people do, but it's not good enough for us. We want to do something exploding. We want some motion, some kind of a little bit more interesting, because it's a game. Usually things are just not dropping unless you have a game that does that, but in our case we want things to kind of go boom. So what I like to do is, once you have this kind of setup, we create a sphere, and what I want to do is I want to basically transfer the normals of the sphere to be the velocity of basically the initial velocity of the pig chunks. So if you can imagine, I want things to kind of explode out, and the way I'm doing that is I'm going to make a sphere. I'm going to add some normals to it, and then I want to transfer the normals to become the velocity of the points, and then that's all you need. So let's add some more resolution to it. Let's add a normal. Let's add make sure it's points, and you can see you got that. And then I'm going to go into an attribute wrangle, but let's not do that yet. So let's do that later. First, let's do. No, we're going to have to do it. So you're going to have to do an attribute transfer to basically to get the velocity from this into this, but you do need a wrangle. So this is a scary bit for people, so I want to try to take the time here and demystify it. I could have done this with just kind of ops and kind of chains, but I wanted to show just how easy and unscary that code is. And I know that it kind of got me for a little bit too, and I was scared of using it, but as you start using it, it becomes less scary. So we have normals in this attribute, right? So we have, if you're going to geometry spreadsheets, come on, not in this guy, this guy. What the hell? I guess not. Why is it? Oh, it's pinned. Okay. So we have some normals here. We want to make a new attribute that is called velocity, or V, and we want to do some kind of scaling to it because just by default it might be too weak. So all we have to do is, so the way variables are kind of assigned or attributes are assigned is with the @ sign. So you have an attribute V equals an attribute normal. And that's all you have to do. And now you should have an attribute called V, which is the same as that attribute. So that's really all there's to it. Not scary at all. If you want to get fancy, you basically put a V in front of it to say that this is a vector. So I have a vector, which means I have 3 floats, and then this is my vector attribute V. V is the name of it. And then I have another vector attribute, which is called normal, or N. And then what I want to do is I want to transfer this attribute, velocity, from my sphere over to my chunks, my pack primitives. And then if we go over, so let's do a quick mark so we can come back to this. If we go into here and do a quick mark here, in this rigid body packed object, which is referencing that, we want to check this inherent velocity point front velocity. And what that does is basically, instead of kind of having an arbitrary velocity you can give it, it's actually going to sample it from the points of the pack primitive. So now if we move it, it does that, which is a little bit better than what we had, but not cool enough. So instead of just falling flat as it did, now it kind of has a little bit of a oof that is happening. So let's kind of crank that up a little bit. So in this point wrangle, let's multiply this by a channel, and let's call that strength. And as you can see, there is no channel called strength, but I just made that up. So if you click this little plus icon, it's actually going to make that attribute for you and give you a slider, which is really nice. So if we crank that to maybe 5, now you got something that's more interesting. And that is, so I like what's going here, but it's a little too uniform, right? It's because I'm just getting that sphere and it's just kind of pushing things out. So what I want to do is I actually want to do a mountain here. And the mountain is just going to do some noise, basically mesh noise. So let's push this. So kind of, because it's just kind of velocities, it doesn't really matter what it looks like, as long as it's kind of weird and funky. And now you got some cool stuff happening. So now instead of just kind of having the thing falling straight down, you have a little bit more style, and you can kind of play with the strength a little bit. You can kind of art direct this, and the nice thing is the usual traditional way of doing destruction is that you will kind of make another object that's invisible that will kind of shove through this other object, and you have this giant wrecking ball, and it's fairly hard to art direct, or it's fairly hard to kind of play with. So with this, you can kind of, it's a little bit easier to kind of play around with it. You can kind of get the shape that you want, and as you can see, the normals, that's basically, it's going to tell where things are going to go. And these kind of like magnitude spikes are kind of misleading a little bit because you imagine that things are going to move out that way. And you can do something like maybe get the position from center to kind of scale that even more. But things are going to kind of go that way. And yeah. So that's pretty good. So I like that a little bit better than just the pig falling down. You can do a lot of cool things with this. So having like a door that's kind of breaking. The other thing you can do here is if you want to kind of make the pig move forward, you can kind of add this impulse back here. and then now that force is kind of happening from there, which is a cool trick. So that's part of that art directing bit. So if you kind of want to have the impulse kind of move forward and out, you can kind of do that. So that's, you can kind of play with this forever. So let's move on. Now you have the basically set up, I think, and I might be wrong, so we'll kind of see if we miss something once it doesn't work. But now you have the kind of general setup, and you can kind of, let's get this to be in game. You could use this tool shelf, the rigid body to FBX, if you want to just grab that in and bring it in as a skeletal mesh. But for our cases, I want to get it in as a vertex animation. So let's do the same setup. In this case, I'm not going to kind of play too much with the materials because you guys already know most of it. So we want to change that to be a rigid body. We want that to be our geometry 1. Texture size is fine. And then you notice that instead of having the normal texture, now I have a rotation texture. And then everything else is the same. So exporting, it's going to be doing, this one takes slightly longer, but not really. And you can see it filled it out. And now these numbers are a little scarier. That is not just like a 250, negative 250 that you can kind of do. So let's hop over to Unreal. And that's the wrong project. Let's do this project. And let me close these stuff out. And let's make a new folder. Let's call this rigid or live. And let's import those meshes out. So now, where do we save? Did we save that thing? Ah, we forgot to save that file. So that's bad. So I saved that as untitled. So that didn't go anywhere. Or that went out to like my docs or something. So let's save this out as live RBD big. And now let's render it again. And it's done. So we can go back into here. Import. Where's live? Big. Bring that in. Defaults are fine. As you can see, that's all good. For some reason, didn't add a material. Let's make a material. Call this live widget mat. And then same way that we did before, you're gonna have this guy. Let's go into material, copy, and paste. And this one is a little bigger, but not really. The only thing is instead of doing position, so like it's just a little less commented, but this is the same as we had before, to where we kind of have the number of frames, kind of adding it. We have DVs, yada yada, read that in, sample the transition or the translation and the rotations, do the bounding box. Now we have position, and then the scarier part is basically this quaternion math, to where we're sampling this rotation and then we're doing quaternion math to get that the rotation to work. This is something that ideally you guys don't have to worry too much about, but if you want to go in there and see how it's done for like the kind of people who are trying to build this in Unity, you can kind of step through it and see what it's doing. And then we also have to rotate the normals to make sure that they're kind of moving along with everything. The other thing that we are doing that's kind of cool is we're writing out the pivot colors, the pivot points to be the vertex colors. So to recreate that motion, we have all of these chunks, right, on this pig. And you can see it's really faded because it's kind of big. But you can kind of see how it's a little bit different. And it's actually small, that's why it's so small. But the idea here is that each chunk has vertex colors assigned to it, so we know what the pivot of each chunk is. So if we know the pivot of each chunk is, we know where it needs to move and how it needs to rotate, we can recreate that whole motion. The way the UVs are set up on this guy is, again, we're doing the same thing with that kind of additional UV set. So that's the first UV set. This is the second UV set, which is going to be a strip. It's probably too small to show. But the idea here is that every vert of the same chunk has the same UV, so they sample the same position, so they move together. So I'll let that sink in a little bit. So let me hook these materials in. And at this point, it should be fairly easy for you guys to do. That goes into normal. this goes into what position offset. The other things that we do want to do is those hints that are there, so I don't forget. So we want to make sure we have 3 custom UVs, so pass the data from Vertex shader to the pixel shader, and turn on tangent space because we're writing data out in world space. So we have UV1, UV2. The reason we don't do this UV0 is because UV0 is the first UV set, which kind of samples the diffuse texture. So if you want to have a diffuse texture, if we use that channel, we would have been blowing the data that's coming from the mesh. So that's why we use the 1 and 2, in case people are wondering. So save that. I think that's all there's to it on this guy. So let's make a make out of it. Material instance, live rigid. You can see my naming convention is garbage, so you guys can hate me on the forums for that one. So now we have the one material. Let's assign it. Then let's assign our textures. So this one I noticed happened before too. So for whatever reason, when it's copy and pasting now on this material, I have to dive into it. It kind of does this 1, 2, 3. So if you see this, it's happened a couple of times that I need to see what the hell's going on. Basically, when I'm pasting it, it's kind of adding this 1 to the end of it. Doesn't do it with all of them. So you can kind of change that back to be not _1. The normalized data kind of doesn't matter because you're not really going to change it, but the bounding box, you don't want to be changing it multiple times. So change these, and then let's change the rotation and the translation. And quickly, rotation, translation. And let's see the bounding box data from Houdini. Copy that, back to here, paste, and Houdini, copy that, and paste. All right, so now you can see in the thumbnail it's starting to look like something. Bring it to this corner, it works. There's a couple of things that is kind of like future development is I don't know how bad the frame rate is over here. You can kind of see the big head boom. The one thing is that I do need to kind of look into the shadows. So the shadows don't really, they only work with the bounding box of the original shape. So ideally, I think I might need to kind of explode the mesh out into the max shape or kind of artificially pad the bounding box somehow to get the shadows to work. But for, yes?
Quick one. Superb technique for blast, says Leonid. How about freezing blast effects? Is it real to stop time blast effects? It is needed to just tweak the time variable in material editor inside Unreal Engine or something else?
Yes, so that's a really good question. So some people don't want to use the time, so let's do that now. That's great. Thanks, Chris. I was going to talk about it. So as you can see, I have this time variable. And if I make this a parameter instead, scalar parameter, and I want to feed that in, and I'll override that, and I want to call this my time. And autosave tricked me. So that's basically, a lot of people ask that question, and they're like, hey, I want to use this in the sequencer. I don't want to kind of deal with the time of the game. How do I do that? So now you have this my time, and you can kind of just animate however you need to animate it. So basically you can kind of, and you can kind of play things back and forth. You can make this part of a blueprint. The other thing too that actually we started to talk about more kind of esoteric ways of using this data is this might not need to be animation, right? This can just be like if you're visualizing a bar graph, and you kind of wanted the bar graph to move and kind of do different things, you can use this to kind of get that animation. It doesn't have to be dynamics; it can be anything. So that's a great question, and that's one of the things that's a gotcha for people that are trying to maybe synchronize skeletal animation with this. Overriding that time parameter lets you do that, and you can do things like you said. You can play it, and then using Blueprint, you can kind of stop halfway. You can kind of stop halfway and then do things where like time is frozen, and then you can kind of have some gameplay event, and then time starts back up. So great question, and absolutely something that you can do. So I'll leave that frozen in time there. The materials also should work, as you can see from the other Unreal demo, if you can see. So like I do have the kind of original pick texture assigned to it, and then I have an outside and an inside. So it's totally doable. You just assign the materials on the inside and outside, and it comes through. So it's not worth spending too much time on that. So now we get to the fun stuff. Now we get to the fire stuff. And the fire stuff is the fluid stuff. So let's go into that. So let's save. And the reason why it's the fun stuff is because the cloth, you kind of could do that with blend shapes. Not really ideal because you blow out of memory. But there's also the Unreal technique to kind of write it out to textures using other software. And then the rigid body one, you could do that too with joints. We had examples at the GDC webinar, not webinar, but the class where there's Martin Lalande did basically a building explosion with like 3,000 chunks, and it plays back fine. That's the other thing too that I'll say, even though I'm kind of running a little slower than I want because we're recording, if we show the kind of shader complexity, which I'm just gonna cheat, I think it's developer, what the hell is it? Oh no, it's lit. Buffer optimizations, yeah, shader complexity. So as you can see, this one has a little bit of red because of all the transparency. It's not the shader, it's just the sprite because you kind of have, I have it on mask right now. But everything else is, the shader is, it's really cheap because you're doing all the math on the vertex shader, not on the pixel shader. Usually there's no bottlenecks there. Usually the vertex shader doesn't do anything, it just passes the data straight through. So if we add a little bit of math there, it's usually not going to be a problem. The shader complexity here on this is because we have just additive on top of additive on top of additive. So let me actually pull this out. So let me see if I can pull out the embers and then go back in there. You can see it's just basically wherever there's an overlap on the transparency, it kind of gets more expensive, and these two materials are additive. And you can see if I just have that as opaque, it's pretty cheap. So this is just regular kind of overhead of doing transparency. It doesn't have anything to do with the Vertex animation stuff. So let's get right into that, because that's the cool one. So if we make a new scene, we drop in a pig again. I'm going to file a bug for that one. Geo, delete, pig. So now we have a pig head again. We want to set it on fire. So we go to pyro, flames. And now the pig is on fire. Not much to it. The couple of things that I will say of note is if you want to kind of sacrifice time for quality, the setting that you want to care about is the sub-steps. So cranking this up to like a 3 or 4 is going to give you a little bit higher quality because just it's simming it a little bit more. And then that's really all the kind of the quality tweaking that I'll do. After this, we'll go into pyro import, and then there's this kind of visualizer and this pyro fields, which is the one I care about. You can see here we have density, which is the smoke. We have velocity, which we're going to use maybe if we have time, maybe not, on advecting the other particles for the embers. And then temperature, heat, and fuel are the ones that we care about. Temperature is just kind of like a thing. Heat is the fire. So we kind of care about these things. If you want to see, what I like to do is I like to change this to rainbow so you can tell the difference between density and heat. What I started to do a while back is I would just I'll skin the whole thing, and then you kind of have these blobby fires because you're basically skinning the smoke, which is not what you want. You could make them separate. You can make one additive and the other one transparent. But for our case, especially if you're doing things like rendering these out to texture as a texture sheet, this is just kind of good information to know about. Someone was asking, how do you select these? What I do is I just delete the ones I don't care about. So if I just want the smoke, I will delete anything that is not smoke. And if I hide the other objects, basically that gives you smoke. And now you can render that. If you Alt click, this duplicates it, so it's kind of like Unreal. So this is awesome. That's new too. So if we go into here and then we change this, I want the heat. So I actually just want the fire. That will give you that. So now you kind of have the fire, which we can mesh. But before we can mesh, so now we kind of have this going. I actually want to write this out to disk because I don't want to keep simming it. So first let's save. And let's do live fire. I want to write this out to disk. We want to save load disk, save. And this will take a tiny little bit to write. What we're going to do next is basically we need to make this thing loop because I want the fire to be looping in my game. I don't want it to kind of have that initial kind of explosion. You could do a mix of two to where you can have two fires, one that's kind of the ignition and then the other one that's the loop. But for our case, we just care about the looping bit. So as you can see, instead of kind of doing the usual thing that's like, well, now I kind of scrubbed it, I needed some changes, it has to calculate everything. Now it's just, I can just play this back, right? So it's kind of nice. So I don't really have to worry about that. So because I don't really care about this first half, maybe I care about maybe from 60 is about where I want to start. Then I want to go maybe to like 120. I want to just do a quick little loop. So see, kind of goes through. Let's make this. And you see it kind of like flops a little bit because of the seam. What I want to do is I want to get rid of that. And to get rid of that, I'll click this Make Loop tool. I will change my number of loops to 1, and then I'll connect it. And then it doesn't loop. It doesn't do that little thing anymore. It doesn't pop. So now you kind of have nice looping geometry that just does as it expected. This is kind of nice because it feels like magic because you just had something that had a giant seam in it and now it's seamless. You can go in and kind of see what I'm doing to I'm basically just offsetting the simulation by half and then just kind of mixing it based on a sine wave. So here you can see I have like a little expression to do sine wave. So we basically have the simulation running and then I kind of cross dissolve it against an offset version of itself, kind of like a Photoshop filter. If you guys do that, where you just take the texture, kind of offset it by half, and you kind of crossfade in where the seam is. Same technique, but done with volumes. So now we have that, and we have a nice looping, flawless fire. Now we want to mesh it. So to mesh it, I use this ISO offset node, and we want to do an ISO surface from a volume. And you can see now you have awesome fire. That looks great. So we want to change this to be by size. So we have a little bit more resolution. So basically the problem with the default is just the grid size. And then you want to kind of play with this offset a little bit to kind of find where in the volume data you kind of want. So 0 is not what you want. You kind of want a little bit above 0, or depending on how much you want to kind of erode that fire for whatever visual look you want, you can do that. As you can see, it's a little kind of clumpy. Upping the sub-steps will kind of smooth that out and kind of give you something a little bit better. But for the sakes of this tutorial, I'm not going to go into that. The other thing to note is if you hit B, you're going to get this pop-up. And the one that you care about here is you want to optimize and you want to remove back faces. So this kind of caught me yesterday when I was running through it, where I went through the whole thing, got it into Unreal, and then my shell was backwards. And I couldn't figure out why it was. And then basically this ISO offset, when it generates it, sometimes it, well, not sometimes, always, it does it backwards. So it's something that we should look into. But in the meantime, basically this just turns backface culling on the rendering so you can see what you're doing. If you do reverse, you can basically get that to be the right way. So now you have mesh, it's geometry, Shift W gives you that. I don't like the way it's kind of quadded, and it kind of does some weird stuff with this kind of crisscrossy, and you kind of get these little slivers. So let's drop a remesh node in there. And what the remesh node does is basically kind of rebuilds that topology to something that is just triangles all the way. Some people like to do smooth, so I think there's like an attribute blur now that is a little bit better smooth. So it kind of softens it a little bit. That's up to you. It's kind of a preference, so you can kind of. Some people don't like the kind of toothiness of the fire, but it's really a personal preference. So I want to take that off because I don't mind the tooth. Then let's see what we have to do. We need to add some normals. And actually, let's poly reduce it first. Because right now I have something that is about 4,000 polygons, which is okay, but I want to, actually it might not be that bad. Ideally, you kind of drop that down. Let's say if we want it to be 1,000 polygons. And you can kind of see, right, like if you want to do a super cartoony thing, you can actually do something that's 500 and have that kind of play and be okay. Then kind of have low poly fire that's actually coming from simulation. The other thing that I want to do is I want to kind of clean some of these small triangles that are happening. So let's do maybe 1,000 polygons. Then there's a couple of little slivers that are kind of hanging out there. So let's drop a clean node. And let's do manifold only. And you can see that kind of eats some of that kind of bad topology. That it's not, we can handle it, but it's just I'd rather not deal with it because I'm wasting resolution on something that doesn't matter. So now we have points. Point normals. In theory, that's all we need. The other thing that we do want is we want to transfer that temperature back from the original sims to this guy. So what we want to do is, and I messed this up to where I cached it. So I'm going to have to do it again. That's okay. So ideally, I make it a loop before I delete it, and then I cache it. So the reason is because I have all this kind of nice data, but it doesn't loop. And then I want to make everything loop before I delete. So let's just do that and just recook it. Because why not? Just to show how easy it is. So we have that, and then actually I don't want to cache the deleted version. I want to cache all of it because then I can pull from that. You can see kind of how fast it's going. If you don't have if you have like the kind of sub-stepped version, it's going to take a little bit longer. That's why I didn't do it, but still it's not bad. So, okay, now we should have all of that data that we can kind of pull the temperature out. So, temperature. If you can click here and see. Technically, you probably don't even need to do this, but you want to do attribute from volume, and you want to take this, and let's try to go straight. So what I want is I want color from temperature, and I want to kind of play with this a little bit. So by default, it's a little too strong, so you can see like if I just do this from 0 to 1, it's basically flooded white. If I do this from 0 to 5, I start to get a little bit of, so if I play with this, I can start getting a little bit of a contrast. Maybe I kind of come from this way. And now you're starting to get something towards like you want that kind of core to be hot, and then it kind of tapers off to dark. And the idea here is they actually get the simulation temperature to drive a texture in game, which is kind of nice. So let's quickly get this into game because we're running out of time. So let's maybe do this at, let's say 1500 polys because it's a little crunchy. Let's write this out to disk again. And let's make it load to disk. Save this out. And what we're going to do is the same as we did before. The nice thing, which I'll kind of go into the detail why this is caching, is the secret with this fire is if I kind of duplicate this out and then blow the material on it, like this. And where is it? Ah, I need to put like a world grid material on it. So in reality, what's happening here is that I export out a bunch of little triangles. And what I do is I reassemble each of these triangles at runtime using the textures. So what we do is we know what the positions of each of these triangles are because they're kind of coming to us from the shader or from the mesh. We subtract that out. So basically we collapse every single point to be at 0, 0, 0. And then in the shader, we sample the texture to kind of move it into wherever it needs to be. This is a really cool technique because unlike Alembic, which kind of stores a mesh every single frame, you already have the mesh there, so all you're doing is you're setting the positions. And because the topology might change, it doesn't really matter because if you don't have, like this, we already know what the max number of polygons you will ever need because we have the whole simulation. So we can write out as many polygons or as many triangles as you're going to need. But if you don't need it for whatever reason, if it's the beginning of it, we can just collapse those down to 0, and then essentially they don't render. They'll probably still take a little bit, but they have 0 pixels on screen. So let's go ahead and import, or not import it, but now we have this guy. So you can see it's moving. It should be looping fine. And it's gonna, it pulsates a little bit, so you guys can play with the loop and the motion and all that stuff. That's on the artistic side. If we go over to out, let's drop in that Vertex Animation Beta. Let's go into the geometry. Is it? No, it's this pyro sim. That's again, name your stuff. PSA, don't be like me. Out. Then you hop back over with your quick marks. Then now we have that out to grab. So we want this to be the fluid. And this is interesting because we have the ability of specifying the basically max number of poly counts, we actually built in a poly reducer inside of it, which I choose always try to not to use it as much as possible because it just drives the export times longer. So I like to do the poly reduce outside, but in case there's a straight frame that has a little bit higher, we can kind of crunch that down to whatever we need to do. Let me just double check again to see what I chose. So I chose 750, really? 1500, that's what it is. So let's do target poly count 1500. Texture size can be at 1024. We want to not pack that, and we want to export a color map. So that's all we should do. We have saved the scene, hit render. It's going to go out. And we're basically going to do the same thing that we did before with the fluid shader code. For this one, for time purposes, I might not even do that. I might just take one of the shader codes that I already had, just because I want to leave you guys time for Q&A. So basically, take that, copy and paste it, and you're going to get something that looks like this. So this is the material hooked up. As you can see, this is exactly pretty much what the cloth one looked like. You have this kind of UV scrolling bit. In this case, we're actually sampling the first UV set, not the second UV set, because you can't really UV that. Technically, you could, but it's not going to be coming from the meshes. If you guys want to talk about that, we can take that offline or talk in the Q&A. Then you have the position, all that stuff, sample the normal map, pack it. That's same story as the other ones. And then in this case, I actually this goes into the normal. I actually added this multiply by 10 just because I wanted to get a little bit of a emissive feel to it, but you don't really need to do that. So let's make our fire. fluid. Move that out. Import. So live fire, live fire, live fire, live fire. Imported.
Hey, Luis.
Yes.
We got a couple of comments that the shader wasn't in the capture region of the video. They couldn't see the shader.
Oh, son of a bit. All right, you're right. Let's go back again. That's a great point. You guys should see it. Okay. That was my other screen. I apologize. So let's do it again. So the shader again is pretty much the same as the cloth one. So we have that kind of UV scroll bit, texture coordinate 1, as I mentioned, and you guys couldn't see. So it's the 0 because we can't sample a texture from the mesh. What we can actually do is we can store the UVs as a different texture, kind of like we're doing with color, and do it that way to where we can kind of sample textures with changing UVs. So that's interesting if you have like cloth ripping or something like that you do need UVs to come from the mesh. Here we have that same kind of pack data coming in. Sample the texture, position, sample the normal, do the stuff. We actually also sample a color map, which is kind of nice, and then we just pack it the same way that we're packing the normal map into custom UV sets. So in this one, we actually need 3 UV sets because we have 6 channels, so we have 3 colors and 3 normals, so we're kind of stuffing them together. And then this was the comment on the multiply. So basically I took the color and I'm basically multiplying it by 10 just because I wanted to give it a little punch. So thanks for that, and I apologize for having it on the second screen. So I'm going to drop that back out. So let's go to live fluid. You can see that mesh again. What it looks like is this. Another thing that you will kind of want to catch is, and I'll show you why, is there some, in build settings, you're going to want to turn on this full precision UVs, but I'll show you what it looks like if you don't, so you can know why. So let's drop in, where is it? Yeah, so it's there, live mesh. Let's pull this out a little bit. Let's just make an instance of this guy. Let's move it to the fluid. And then let's call this live fire. And let's assign it. So let's see. So this looks pretty much like all of the other materials, except it has that kind of color attribute stuff. So we have a color map, we have a position map. We do not want to back to normal in our case. Drop that in, drop the color, and drop the position. And then number of frames is not, so let's see, this is not rendering yet because the bounding box is wrong and the number of frames. But I'll show you what it looks like if you get the number of frames wrong, because it's pretty crazy. So let's go in here. Let's come up. So my bounding box is this. That's max. So you can see it starts to come because of the scale. And then the low is there. And you can see that it's almost right, but it kind of doesn't look right at all. And sometimes people will get something that looks like this, and they're like, what the hell? You can see kind of strobes. I don't know if the frame rate can show well, but that's what it looks like, because basically those triangles are kind of symbols themselves throughout the whole thing. It kind of goes crazy if you have the wrong frame range.
And Luis,
so, yeah.
You apply Fresnel to the fluid, and if so, what does the setup have to be?
What was the question? Do I apply what?
You apply Fresnel?
Yes. So you can kind of see already. Yeah. So let's do that. So here I have the color. It's kind of doing that. Let's look at the material. So if we have that material, right now, is this thing emissive? Yeah, it's additive, that's why. Okay, so let's change that to be, I guess we can leave it additive. So the additive is what's making it transparent. Let me just for a quick second show you what the opaque looks like. So it's going to compile. So you can see it. It looks like what we did. It has that multiply by 10, so you can kind of see the core kind of dancing a little bit. So let's make it additive, which is not what the default is, but what I like to do. And then if we do it additive, then we can add a Fresnel to kind of multiply against it. So by changing it to additive, you can see the little black tips will fade out, because basically with additive, you're just adding to the scene. So you can see now it's kind of, the cool areas are transparent. And then let's add that Fresnel. And then, so it's going to basically have to multiply against this emissive color. So if we just do Fresnel. And this might not work at all. So I'll be prepared for that. Probably want to do that to the base color as well. Let's just see what pure Fresnel looks like. Sorry for hitting the microphone. Connect the normal to this normal. And it's compiling. So there you can kind of see. You can do things like right now you're getting the Fresnel where the edges are the things that are doing it, but you can kind of play with kind of eating away the center by doing so if you play with this, the Fresnel node, the exponent kind of controls the fall off, and then this base reflection controls the middle. So if we kind of drop that Fresnel to 0 and then the 3, you're going to see it a little bit softer and with nothing in the core. So you can kind of see how you can do that, and then you can go in and you can multiply your colors after the fact and everything. So great question, and you can see how it works as it would. The other thing that I wanted to touch on, which we're really kind of crunching against that Q&A time, so I'm just going to do it quickly. You can see here I have this kind of ramp going on, and I actually created this ramp in Houdini, so I wanted to just quickly show how it is, because we have this ability of doing this color ramp to kind of drive. It's not on this material, but it should be. Oh no, I broke it because I put the Fresnel stuff. But basically, there is a color ramp parameter in here somewhere. Yeah, that you can kind of use to get a little bit of a interesting color. And the way we do that in Houdini is if we go into the image and we drop in an image. So if we switch to this composite view, that's basically a 2D image editor. So if we drop a ramp, now we basically have a full ramp setup. And then I want to change my image to be actually 4 by 256 because I want this to be tiny. If I hit spacebar H, it will kind of focus everything back in. Then we can just use the points to kind of do my regular kind of curve setup to where I can do my orange and up. Let's do orange there. Let's delete that point. Blue, and then that white. Let's do red. But you can see how you can kind of play with that, and you can kind of come here and you can kind of drag it, and you can play with the interpolation and the curves. And then when you're ready, you can just right-click here, and then you save image, and then you just pick wherever you want it to go. So in this case, I just have a target, so I can just shave it, and then that's it. So that's kind of a nice whole other side thing of Houdini that a lot of people don't really use, but to kind of make quick little textures. This is kind of awesome, so you can do shape. Sometimes I use this to kind of make little star bursts or other kind of textures, so I can just kind of come here and make a star and then make lots of things. Make sure it's a square sized. So you can kind of get, and you can chain these together, right? So you can go blur. So it's a nice whole other suite of things that it's super useful for a game artist that maybe not everybody knows, but I just wanted to touch on that. And I think we have 2 minutes until Q&A, so I'll just dive into that and we can kind of do a little bit more freeform. So I'll open it up to questions.
So we've got, can you make the fire shader interact with the wind or movement in Unreal 4?
No, you cannot. But if you want to do something like that, Popcorn Effects actually has a way to doing that. So you should look into their product. They can only do point, like the Ember stuff, but it looks really convincing and you can make it interact with forces in Unreal. In our case, it's just strictly cached out from Houdini.
Everything seemed pretty automatic in Unreal. Is Unity more manual or automatic, or about the same?
It's about the same. I have to kind of play with it. To be honest, I haven't done it a lot, but in theory, it's the same. You just on the Unity side, it should just be you import the meshes and you import the textures, and you make a material and you apply those. There's really not a lot of shenanigans. The most shenanigans part might be somehow how we distribute the code. In our case, it was nice to be able to just do the drag and drop or the copy and paste. But if we have to just give you files, we'll just give you files.
Topology cannot change. So this is back from about half an hour ago, but
yes, I guess that's correct. So on this example, that's why we have both. So on the cloth, the topology cannot change, and it's more efficient for those reasons because you basically have a third less points because you're not having everything exploded out. But if you do want it to change, we also have the fluid technique, which kind of lets you do it that way.
Also, nice technique for cause fire is use lerp function where alpha is Houdini color attribute. It is a cool feature to mix two or bigger color. Does that make sense?
No, it does not. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
Or can you say it to me?
It will come back to it. Leonid, if you can rephrase that a little bit, that'd be great. Said also nice technique for colorized fire is to use the lerp function where alpha is Houdini CV attribute. There's a cool feature to mix two or bit more bigger colors. Mix two or bigger color.
Yeah, let's go back to that one.
Yeah, we'll come back to it.
I think what he meant is that it's a cool technique to be able to kind of just use a ramp to then use that as the kind of the blending scale. So yeah, thanks. That's an old-timey. Basically, people do that in sprites to where they'll have the color ramp and then they'll have the sprite sheet kind of just being a temperature. But I figure we can apply the same technique that we did in 2D to be in 3D.
Magnus is asking if you can use displacement maps on fluids or cloth vertex animations.
In theory, yes. The only problem is on the fluids, you're going to have to also write out UV, and you have to have your meshes UV, or you can do it like he did, which he did some triplanar projection stuff, to where basically the UVs are generated on the fly, basically just projecting it. But in theory, yeah, you should be able to do basically another map that just has some displacement that you use, kind of like a normal map would.
And I think that is all the questions right now.
All right, sweet.
Oh, wait, a couple just came in. In what situations should I be using Vertex Animation RBDs versus joint-based FBX?
Okay, that's a great question. It really comes down to, in my opinion, the amount of chunks that you're going to have. So if you're going to have above maybe 100 chunks, I would use the texture version. And if you're going to have less than 100, I would use the mesh. But even then, the texture one is always going to be cheaper in my book, just because you're not going to be taxing the CPU at all. It's all going to be in the GPU.
If you need to distribute blast pieces on the complex mesh, not just a plane, for this cinematic blast scenario, I need to import geo from game engine to Houdini for right distribution geo pieces on the surface, then bake the texture simulation result, and that's all?
Yes, so you could do that. So basically, if I'm understanding the question correctly, if you have data already in Unreal and you want to get it out and then you want to get it simulated and back in, you could do that. You could actually use the Houdini engine to do something like that. So Rob McGee has a video on basically simulating pipes inside of Unreal, which is pretty awesome. And then part of the kind of future plans for the engine plugin is to support simulation data in this format natively. So yeah, you can just get the data out of Houdini, maybe use your level as collision and then simulate against it and kind of play it back. Or in the future, you're going to be able to do it strictly inside. And if you want to try it, in theory, it should work, but we're going to make it easier for you.
Burke is asking, so he's been a Houdini user for 3 years, but he's just getting into games. So where's a good website to start learning? So I'd suggest that's a good segue to talk about your tutorial page.
Yeah, let me see if I can bring that up. And it's up. That's awesome. So yesterday I put this together, which is just a giant list of tutorials. These are the ones that I kind of like. I'm going to add some more today because I put this up and people are like, oh, you forgot Houdini tricks and you forgot all this stuff. So I'm going to be updating this. The point of this is to be a live list, and then as things kind of get outdated, there's some that are really good but have been kind of displaced by some of these techniques. So I'm trying to keep them as fresh as possible. There's a section for use cases, which is kind of like, hey, I need to convince my company, or I want to kind of show people how cool Houdini is. These are kind of really great examples of just what can you do with Houdini. For getting started, there's like literally like, and this should be fixed.
And I just posted it to the chat window, so if anybody's looking for that link, that's where it is. It's also on SideFX.com under the in the tutorial section.
Yeah, but there's basically, this is Johnny who works at EA, and he taught at Texas A&M. Great whole series of classes. So there's like lots of stuff. And then there's Kim Goosens, who taught at NTV Breda and HTV in the Netherlands. Also really good training. And then there's a bunch of little, like, not little, but like Plural side and game theories. There's lots of stuff. And then we start getting into deeper dives and little specific questions. Peter Quince has awesome stuff. Yeah, so go in here. That's a great place to start learning.
Indeed. Let's see if there's any final questions. A couple of questions. Wondering if one wanted to use Houdini in VR. Would it be similar tutorials?
Yes. So the idea is, if you are just using Houdini for VR, this is where the techniques really come to life, because in VR you kind of need volume to your particles. So that's where this kind of was designed. So absolutely, if you're just using Unreal for VR, yes, you can totally use it.
And we've got a couple of good videos featuring Oculus and Mike Murdoch and some of the other VR artists that have used Houdini for VR. They're on our site. What communities do you recommend for someone learning Houdini and VFX for games?
There's two. There's the Slack channel, which is techartist.org. If you go there, and there should be a Slack link. So that one is kind of invitation to where some people have to approve it. It takes a little bit to get approved. And then the other one is the Discord server. And the Discord server, we'll put a link to both of those up. But the idea there is there's just giant community that kind of, I think there's about like 300 people online every day, and there's a nice mix of games and film, and they kind of just help each other out, which is really nice. So there's people from film getting into games, just kind of learn how to do Houdini stuff or Unreal stuff, and then there's people from games kind of just wanting to learn how to do Houdini better, and the film people kind of come in and help them out. So Discord and techartist.org. I think it's Think Procedural is the name of the Discord channel. Is unofficial, community-driven, but it's pretty awesome.
Here's another cue. Regarding 2D flipbooks and extracting the various elements as separate masks, for example, fuel, temperature, heat, etc., would you go through the same process as you did earlier, get the elements separately from the import pyro, and then assign a flat white color shader in render?
Yes, you can do that. And the other thing you can also do, let me see if I got it back into that. That's one way to where you just apply a plain color. If you go into here and you go into the materials, you can just turn off things. So you can basically duplicate the geometry or do like object merges, which you can do, and I can show you how to do that. But the idea is basically you duplicate these flames, you make one that maybe called smokes, and then you turn off the fire, so there's only the smoke. And then if you only want the fire, you can turn that on and off, and then kind of change this to be grayscale. So you can do it that way. And then on the object, I would just make a new geometry. I would merge in the original one, so it'd be this pyro import, which is not that one, but you get the idea. And then in here, you just pick a different material, and it'll be matte, so smokes. So you could do it that way too. Then you have two renders, one that renders this guy, the other one that renders that guy.
Would particle animations work with the same workflow?
Yes. Sadly, I think we kind of just ran out of time, but it's exactly the same, and that's why I didn't really get into it, because that's after some point it's just the same. I'll still send you guys the files with the advec, but it's essentially you go in here, you say source particles from that kind of fire, and then in the pops there's an advec by volume that you drop in, and basically you read in the SOP that you had to generate it, but then exporting it out is the same exact thing.
Randolph mentioned that, I guess you mentioned a book a while ago. Remember the book name or the name? You mentioned a book.
A book? No. There's, what the hell's it called? I have to, I don't remember, but I can look it up and I can think about it. I can give some book recommendations. There's one from a Disney animator that's the only one that I always recommend. There's two of them that people on the channel might know what it is, but it's basically for hand-drawn effects. But that's, let me see, it's like.
Randolph, we don't have a book, and I'm pretty sure, Luis, you haven't written a book.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so maybe you're thinking of his site, where he lists the tutorials pages or something. But how about HDA directly in Unreal Marketplace? Is it real? Because many Unreal Engine users looks with interesting to HDA to Unreal Engine, like procedural IV, L system trees, maze generator, etc.
Yeah, do it, please. It's fair game. So you only have to make a little note saying that Unreal or the Houdini engine is required, and then yeah, because the Houdini engine is free and people have to download it, so it's not different than any other plugin required.
Everybody's reminding us the name of the book, which is Elemental Magic.
That's what it is. Thank you, people.
Yeah. Thanks.
Hive Mind. Yeah, Elemental Magic. There's 2 volumes, and it's pretty awesome. It's just, I don't know if I ever mentioned it, but it's kind of a good way of, it's really good. Highly recommended.
Yeah. Cool. I think that's about it. Thanks, Luis. Thanks, everybody. We'll be wrapping this up and posting the video in the next day or two. We'll give registrants advance access and then post it to the public in about a week or so.
Sweet. Thanks, everybody. I hope this was helpful, and keep pinging me. I'm on both of those channels, so the Slack and the Discord. So just send me if you guys had questions I didn't want to ask over here. Just hit me over there, and I'll be around. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.